Three thugs cornered a terrified mother and her child in a crowded restaurant, thinking they were untouchable, until a shadow moved from the corner table and changed the atmosphere in the room. They didn't realize they were operating in the personal sanctuary of the city's most feared Mafia don, and he was watching every move with cold, lethal calculation. He walked up, adjusted his cuff to reveal a serpent tattoo, and delivered a 5-word warning that turned their arrogance into absolute terror. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. Alright, let's get back into it. The restaurant was named Bellissimo Italian for most beautiful, and tonight it lived up to the name. Golden light cascaded from chandeliers that cost more than most people's cars, pooling on white linen tablecloths so pristine they looked untouched by human hands. Violins played somewhere in the periphery, soft enough to feel expensive. The air carried the scent of saffron risotto and aged wine, wealth distilled into aroma. This was the kind of place where problems arrived dressed in tailored suits and French cuffs, where violence wore cologne and spoke in polite tones. At the corner table, partially hidden by an ornamental pillar, a woman in a beige trench coat sat rigid with contained terror. Her dark hair was pulled back, emphasizing the sharp angles of fear in her face. Her daughter, maybe 6 years old, wearing a knit beanie the color of caramel pressed into her mother's side like she was trying to disappear into the fabric itself. The child's small fingers gripped the coat so tightly her knuckles had gone white. 3 men in black suits formed a wall around them. The first one, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed carved from dismissive arrogance, smiled. The kind of smile that never reached the eyes. The second stood with arms crossed, blocking the natural path to the restrooms, watching the room like a bouncer at a funeral. His expression was bored, professional, detached. The third leaned down close to the woman, his hand closing around the collar of her beige coat, pulling her slightly forward. His voice was intimate, conversational, cruel. "You know why we're here, Alicia. Let's not make this complicated." Other diners glanced over, then quickly away. Eyes returned to entrees. Conversations resumed at lower volumes. A couple near the window adjusted their napkins. A businessman checked his phone. The unspoken rule of wealth. Someone else's problem. That's when the fourth man moved. He came from behind the three, cutting across the dining room with the kind of stride that didn't hesitate or announce itself, just covered ground with purpose. Black suit, no tie, the top button of his dark shirt undone. Dark hair slicked back severely, revealing a face all sharp lines and darker intentions. Tattoos crept from beneath his cuffs like secrets that refused to stay hidden. Serpentine patterns, thorns, symbols that carried weight beyond decoration. His expression wasn't angry. It was evaluating. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stopped beside their table and spoke. "Wrong table. Wrong day, gentlemen." The room held its breath for half a heartbeat. The man gripping Alicia's collar froze. His smile evaporated like steam. The one blocking the aisle turned slowly, shoulders tensing beneath expensive fabric. The third, the one who'd been watching the room with professional detachment, went very, very still, his eyes widening just enough to betray recognition. "Who the hell are you?" The first one growled, but his hand loosened on Alicia's coat. His voice carried false bravado, the kind men use when they've just realized they've made a terrible miscalculation. The stranger didn't blink. His dark eyes held the kind of calm that precedes hurricanes. Someone who doesn't repeat himself. His right hand moved not to a pocket, not to a weapon, but to straighten his cuff with deliberate slowness, exposing more of the dark ink beneath. A serpent coiled around a rose, thorns dripping like blood. The movement was casual, almost theatrical, but the message was clear. The three men recognized something. Not the tattoo itself, the authority behind it. The little girl whimpered softly, her voice barely audible over the resumed murmur of distant conversations. "Mommy," and just like that, everything in the stranger's posture changed. His jaw tightened, his eyes, cold and calculating a moment before, flashed with something older, deeper, and far more dangerous than strategy. The muscles in his neck tensed, his breathing slowed, deepened, became the kind of controlled rage that doesn't explode but compresses, becoming denser, heavier, more inevitable, personal. The man gripping Alicia's collar tried to recover his authority. "This doesn't concern you, signore. Private business. Walk away." And the stranger stepped closer, close enough that the man had to tilt his head back slightly to meet his eyes. close enough that the violins in the background seemed to fade into static, close enough that other diners stopped pretending not to watch. "Take your hand off her." It wasn't a threat, it was a forecast. The man's fingers twitched, still tangled in beige fabric. His companions shifted their weight, hands drifting toward jacket pockets slowly, carefully, testing boundaries. The air between them became charged, crackling with the electricity of violence about to be born. The little girl buried her face in her mother's coat and started to cry, not loud, theatrical sobs, but the quiet, hiccuping kind that came from a soul too young to understand why bad things happen to good people. The stranger's eyes tracked the movement, watched the child disappear into her mother's arms, watched the way fear lived in her small body. Something ancient and unmovable settled into his expression. He took another step forward. For 3 long seconds, no one moved. The entire restaurant seemed to exist in the space between breaths, chandeliers frozen mid-sparkle, wine suspended in glasses, time itself negotiating with inevitability. Then the man's hand opened. Alicia gasped, a sharp intake of breath that carried 3 years of fear in a single sound. She pulled her daughter tighter, wrapping both arms around the child like a human shield. The stranger didn't step back. He shifted his weight, positioning himself directly between the 3 men and the table. His body became a wall, calm, immovable, and absolutely ready. The kind of ready that didn't need to announce itself because everyone in proximity could feel it like barometric pressure before a storm. "Now," he said, his voice returning to conversational volume but losing none of its edge, "you're going to tell me who sent you." The man who'd been gripping Alicia's collar, the one with the arrogant face and rapidly crumbling confidence, glanced at his companions. One of them shook his head slightly, a tiny movement that screamed, "Abort mission. We don't answer to—" "You do now." The stranger's hand moved to his inner jacket pocket. All 3 men tensed, muscles coiling, hands freezing halfway to weapons they'd never have time to draw. He pulled out his phone, held it up, pressed a single contact. The phone rang once, twice. The entire restaurant leaned in without moving. The phone continued ringing in Alberto Santana's hand, each tone sharp and deliberate in the hushed restaurant. But before anyone could answer, Alicia Matthews felt the room tilt sideways. Not literally, nothing actually moved. But in her mind, the chandeliers blurred into smears of gold, the murmuring conversation stretched into white noise, and all she could feel was Marilyn's heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. How did we end up here? The question had haunted her for 3 years, but tonight it arrived with teeth. 72 hours earlier, Alicia had been standing in a courthouse hallway, hands shaking so badly she'd had to grip her purse with both fists to keep them still. A man in an expensive suit, lawyer for Avalon Holdings, had approached her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Matthews, you don't have to do this. Testimony in civil cases can be complicated. Memories fade, details blur. No one would blame you for reconsidering." She'd almost walked away. Almost. Then she'd thought about David, her husband, Marilyn's father, crushed under scaffolding that had been cited for safety violations 3 times. Scaffolding owned by a shell company that never fixed anything, because dead construction workers didn't cost as much as steel reinforcements. She'd walked into that courtroom and said his name, David Matthews. She'd said it clearly, loudly, for the record, and she'd watched the lawyers' faces change. 48 hours earlier, a man had knocked on her apartment door. Not the building's front door, her apartment door. 4th floor, the one with the double deadbolt she'd installed herself. "Package delivery," he'd called through the wood. She hadn't ordered anything. She'd looked through the peephole and seen no uniform, no box, just a man in a black jacket checking his phone with the casual patience of someone who had all night. She hadn't opened the door. He'd knocked again the next morning, and again that evening. On the 3rd knock, Marilyn had asked, "Mommy, why doesn't he leave the package?" Because there was no package, Alicia had thought. Because I testified against people who make problems disappear. 24 hours earlier, her supervisor at the medical supply company where she worked inventory had called her into his office. George, 50-something, kind eyes, 2 daughters of his own. "Alicia, I need you to take some time off. Paid leave. 2 weeks, maybe 3. "Why? Did I do something wrong?" "No, God, no." He'd rubbed his face, looking 10 years older than he had that morning. "Someone called, asked questions about you, your schedule, your commute, whether you had family. I didn't like how they asked. Who? They didn't say. But Alicia." He'd leaned forward, lowering his voice. "My brother works in city licensing. He says Avalon Holdings has connections. the kind that don't show up on incorporation papers. She'd left work early, picked Marilyn up from school 2 hours ahead of schedule, and tried to figure out where someone could hide when they had $147 in checking and no family within 3 states. Tonight, she'd made a mistake born of desperation and bad advice. Her neighbor, a law student named Rashida, who sometimes babysat Marilyn, had suggested meeting her cousin at Bellissimo. He works in witness protection adjacent stuff. Victim advocacy. He might know resources, safe houses, legal options. I can't afford Bellissimo, Alicia had protested. You're meeting him, not ordering the tasting menu. Get a glass of water, talk for 20 minutes, leave. No one's going to throw you out. So she'd put on her best coat, the beige trench she'd bought for David's funeral, still clean, still respectable, and brought Marilyn because leaving her alone felt more dangerous than bringing her along. They'd arrived at 7:47 p.m. The cousin hadn't. At 7:52, her phone buzzed. Stuck in traffic. 30 minutes late. So sorry. At 8:03, 3 men in black suits had walked in. At 8:04, one of them locked eyes with her across the dining room. At 8:05, they'd surrounded her table. Now, with the phone still ringing in the stranger's hand and Marilyn crying softly into her coat, Alicia felt the full weight of every decision that had led here. Every choice she'd thought was brave. Every moment she'd believed the system would protect her. Every naive assumption that doing the right thing mattered. The phone clicked to speaker. Pronto. A voice answered gravelly, irritated, distorted slightly by the speaker. It's me, the stranger said, his eyes never leaving the 3 men. I'm at Bellissimo. I have 3 of your men here. They seem confused about their orders. A pause. Alicia heard traffic noise in the background. Distant horns. The rumble of a truck. I didn't send anyone to. Exactly. The stranger's thumb moved meaningfully toward the end call button. So when I put you on speaker, you're going to explain to them and to everyone listening why they're about to lose more than just their jobs. The lead thug, the one who'd gripped her collar, went pale. Actually pale. Color draining like someone had opened a valve. Who authorized a move in the Bellissimo district without clearance? The voice on the phone demanded. We were told it came from upstairs, Bruno said. Bruno? The name landed like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Alicia didn't know who Bruno was. But watching the 3 men's faces, watching the fear calcify into something closer to existential terror, she understood one thing clearly. They'd made a mistake. Not in coming for her, in where they'd come for her. The stranger ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped below the range of the violins, below the clink of silverware, into a register that made Alicia's spine straighten involuntarily. You've just learned something important. In this world, you're only as valuable as the name backing you. And right now? He let the pause stretch until it became painful. You don't have one. The lead thug's hands started to shake. Get out. Through the kitchen. Quietly. And if I ever see you operate in my city again without explicit clearance. He leaned in. Just slightly. You won't see me coming. They moved. Not running, pride wouldn't allow that, but fast. Weaving between tables toward the service corridor. Heads down. Postures collapsed like buildings post-demolition. The stranger turned back to her table. Alicia stared up at him, tears streaming freely now. Mascara she'd carefully applied 3 hours ago, tracking black lines down her cheeks. Marilyn peeked out from behind her coat, brown eyes wide, beanie slightly askew, face blotchy from crying. For a moment, the man just stood there. Tall, dark-suited, tattooed, terrifying, but something in his expression had softened. Not gentle, but human. He crouched down slowly, carefully, until he was at Marilyn's eye level. I'm sorry you had to see that, he said, his voice completely different now, quieter, stripped of command, almost tender. Those men won't bother you again. Marilyn studied him with the brutal honesty only children possess. Are you a bad man too? The question hit the air like a slap. Are you a bad man too? The question hung in the air between them, innocent, direct, devastating. Alberto Santana held the child's gaze. Those wide brown eyes expected honesty, and something in him refused to lie to her the way adults had lied to him when he was small and afraid and asking the same questions. I've done bad things, he admitted quietly, but not tonight. It wasn't the answer adults gave children. It wasn't reassuring or simple or wrapped in comfortable fiction, but it was true, and somehow, the little girl seemed to accept it. He stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement. 43 wasn't old, but the years had accumulated in his joints like unpaid debts. He removed his jacket, still warm from his body, and draped it carefully over Alicia's shoulders. "You need to tell me why they came for you," he said. "Not here, not now, but soon." Alicia nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I testified. Against a property company. They were involved in my husband's death." Alberto's jaw tightened. He knew what that meant before she said the name. What was the company called? Avalon Holdings. Merda. He knew it. Shell company. Money laundering pipeline. Part of the infrastructure he'd approved 3 years ago when Bruno had presented it as a clean investment vehicle, property management, rental portfolios, legitimate revenue streams. Alberto had signed off without asking enough questions. Now this woman, this widow, had testified against his own ecosystem, and someone inside had tried to silence her using his streets, his reputation, his name as cover. Alberto Santana hadn't always been the kind of man who controlled cities from the shadows. At 17, he'd been a runner. Low-level, expendable. The kind of kid who delivered packages he never opened and asked no questions, because questions got you killed. His mother had worked 3 jobs to keep him in Catholic school, to keep him away from the streets, to build walls around him made of prayer and exhaustion. The streets had found him anyway. By 25, he'd learned the rules. Loyalty bought time, silence bought survival, and violence was a language spoken only when necessary, and never in anger. Men who lost control lost everything. By 30, he'd consolidated power through patience. He didn't fight his way to the top, he waited there, building networks while others burned energy on territory wars and ego. When the old guard collapsed under federal indictments, Alberto was the only one left standing with clean hands and viable infrastructure. By 40, he'd built something unprecedented, an empire that operated like a corporation. Hierarchies, accountability, strategic planning, no unnecessary violence, no civilian casualties, no collateral damage. He had rules. Tonight, 3 of his own men had violated every single one. Alberto turned away from Alicia's table and walked back toward his own, nodding once to the Maitre de Vincent, 60-something, 20 years at Bellissimo, a man who knew when to see everything and when to see nothing. "The lady and her daughter," Alberto said quietly as he passed. "Their meal is on my account. Anything they want. Send them home in a car. Private service, not a taxi. Driver, I know. Of course, Mr. Santana. No questions. No hesitation." That was the advantage of reputation. It eliminated the need for explanation. Alberto sat down at table 12, his usual spot, positioned with clear sightlines to both entrances and the kitchen corridor. His whiskey sat where he'd left it, untouched and now lukewarm. He didn't pick it up. He was thinking, Bruno, Franco Bruno, 48, second-generation organized crime, ambitious but sloppy. He ran the real estate operations, legitimate property management companies on the surface, money laundering and debt collection underneath. Alberto had given him autonomy because Bruno's operations generated steady, clean revenue without drawing attention. Apparently, that autonomy had been a mistake. Alberto pulled out his phone, scrolled through contacts, and selected a name, Gianni. The call connected on the first ring. "See, I need you to pull every file on Avalon Holdings. Property acquisitions, tenant complaints, safety violations, lawsuits, everything." A pause. "How far back?" 3 years. That's a lot of paper." "Then start now." Alberto's voice carried no room for negotiation. "And Gianni? Do it quietly. Bruno doesn't hear about this." "Capito." Alberto ended the call and sat back, his mind assembling pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed until 20 minutes ago. A widow testifies. 3 enforcers show up at an upscale restaurant, his restaurant, in his territory to intimidate her. They invoke his authority without permission. They involve a child. Someone was either monumentally stupid or deliberately testing boundaries. Both possibilities required correction. His phone buzzed. Text from Vincent, the maitre d'. "The lady is asking to speak with you before she leaves." Alberto glanced across the restaurant. Alicia stood near the entrance, his jacket still around her shoulders, her daughter holding her hand. She looked terrified and determined in equal measure, the expression of someone who'd run out of options but refused to stop moving. He stood and crossed the dining room. Up close, Alicia Matthews looked younger than he'd initially thought. Maybe 32, 33. Dark hair, angular features, the kind of elegant bone structure that expensive cosmetics tried to replicate. But her eyes carried years of exhaustion, the kind that came from fighting battles alone. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now, steadier. For whatever just happened. "You don't need to thank me. Alberto's tone was neutral, professional. You need to be safe. Why did you help us? The question was direct, unflinching. You don't know me. And those men. They knew you, feared you. That means you're... She stopped herself, glancing down at Marilyn. Connected, Alberto finished. Yes. So why? It was the same question the child had asked, dressed in adult vocabulary. Alberto looked at Marilyn, who was watching him with that same unsettling directness. She'd stopped crying, but her grip on her mother's hand remained vice-tight. Because no one should be afraid in a place like this, he said simply. And because your daughter shouldn't have to learn what fear tastes like before she's old enough to spell it. Alicia's eyes glistened. The driver Vincent mentioned will take you wherever you need to go. Tonight, tomorrow, next week. You have his number now. I can't afford. You're not paying. Alberto's voice carried finality. Consider it an apology. For what? For the system that allowed tonight to happen. Alicia studied him for a long moment, trying to reconcile the man who'd terrified 3 armed thugs with the one now speaking to her daughter with careful gentleness. What happens now? She asked. Now you go home. Lock your doors. Tomorrow someone will contact you about more permanent arrangements. Alberto paused. The people who sent those men tonight? They won't send anyone else. How can you be sure? His expression hardened just enough to remind her exactly who she was talking to. Because I'm going to make sure they can't. He watched them leave Alicia and Marilyn climbing into the black sedan Vincent had summoned. The driver, one of Alberto's most trusted men. Ex-military, family man, someone who understood the assignment without needing details. As the car pulled away, Alberto felt something shift in his chest. Not regret, not doubt, resolve. For 15 years, he'd built his empire on emotional distance, on rules that kept him separate from the consequences of his decisions. Tonight, he'd stepped across that line, and standing there under the golden glow of Bellissimo's entrance, watching taillights disappear into city traffic, Alberto Santana made a decision that would reshape everything. Some lines, once crossed, redefined the map. Alberto returned to table 12, but he didn't sit. The whiskey glass still waited, condensation pooling at its base, amber liquid catching chandelier light. He stared at it for 3 seconds, then signaled Vincent. Coffee, black, and tell the kitchen I need the security footage from tonight. Everything from 7:45 to now. Vincent's expression didn't change. Of course, Mr. Santana. Also, Alberto's voice dropped lower. Who made the reservation for table 7? Table 7? Vincent pulled out his small leather reservation book, the old-fashioned kind that relied on pen and paper rather than tablets. His finger traced down the evening's entries. No reservation, sir. Walk in. The lady arrived at 7:47, asked for a quiet table, and the 3 men? Separate entry, 8-3. They didn't check in with the host stand, just walked in. Alberto's jaw tightened. In a restaurant like Bellissimo, people didn't just walk in. Not past Vincent, not past the host stand, not without being seen, assessed, and mentally catalogued, unless they'd been here before, unless they knew the layout. Pull the reservation logs for the past 3 months, Alberto said. I want to know if any of those 3 have eaten here before. Vincent nodded and disappeared toward the back office. Alberto finally sat, his mind running calculations that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with patterns. The coffee arrived moments later, dark, strong, Italian roast that smelled like focus distilled into liquid form. He drank it while he thought. The official story was simple. Alicia Matthews owed money, rent arrears, late payments, the kind of debt that justified intimidation in certain circles, collection tactics that skirted legality but stayed common enough to be invisible. Alberto had heard the claim when Carlo stammered through his excuse. Just here to collect what's owed, signore. Nothing personal. But Alberto had been reading people and reading through people for 25 years, and nothing about tonight tracked with a collection operation. First, the location. Bellissimo wasn't where you confronted debtors. It was expensive, visible, full of witnesses with money and connections. If you wanted to intimidate someone over unpaid rent, you cornered them at their apartment, their workplace, somewhere private where fear had room to expand. You didn't do it in front of crystal chandeliers and violin music. Second, the positioning. Alberto had watched them work the table. One blocking the aisle, one controlling the physical interaction, one watching the room for interference. That wasn't collection, that was extraction. They'd positioned themselves like a team preparing to move someone against their will, corners covered, exits controlled, attention managed. If Alicia had stood up, if she'd tried to leave, they would have stopped her. Not with overt violence. Not yet, but they would have stopped her. Third, the child. Collectors didn't bring fear to children. It was bad business created witnesses, escalated situations, drew the wrong kind of attention. Professional intimidation stayed focused on the target, applied pressure to leverage points, avoided emotional escalation. But Carlo had smiled at the little girl's fear. He'd enjoyed it. That wasn't about money. That was about sending a message written in a 6-year-old's nightmares. Vincent returned carrying a tablet and a manila folder. Security footage is queued up, and I found something in the logs. Alberto gestured to the seat across from him. Vincent sat unusual, but the restaurant had mostly emptied after the confrontation. Only 3 tables remained occupied, diners finishing desserts and pretending they hadn't witnessed anything unusual. Show me. Vincent opened the folder. Inside were photocopied pages from reservation logs, specific entries highlighted in yellow. Carlo Vanetti. Dined here 6 times in the past 2 months. Always Friday or Saturday nights. Always parties of 4 or more. Always paid cash, tipped exactly 15%. Alberto's eyes narrowed. 6 times? Yes, sir. Carlo was muscle. Low-level enforcer. The kind of man who collected gambling debts and provided security for shipments. His legitimate income, what he claimed on taxes, barely covered rent in a decent neighborhood. He had no business eating at Bellissimo once, let alone 6 times. Who was he dining with? Vincent flipped to the next page. Different people each time. But one name appears on 4 of the 6 reservations, he pointed. Alberto read the name and felt something cold settle in his stomach. Luca Bruno. Franco Bruno's nephew. 28. Ambitious. Hungry for status his uncle's position provided. Alberto had met him twice, once at a wedding, once at a business dinner, that was really an introduction to the network. Both times, Luca had struck him as performatively respectful, the kind of man who said yes, sir, while his eyes calculated angles. Pull Luca's credit card receipts, Alberto said quietly. I want to know everywhere he spent money in the past 3 months. Restaurants, hotels, cash withdrawals, everything. That will take time. And discretion. Then be discreet. Alberto's voice carried steel wrapped in silk. But be thorough. Vincent nodded and left the table. Alberto opened the tablet and pulled up the security footage. The camera angle covered the dining room from above the bar, wide lens view that captured roughly 70% of the tables. Alberto scrubbed backward through the timeline until he found 7:47 p.m. Alicia entered the frame beige coat, dark hair, holding Marilyn's hand. She looked around uncertainly, the body language of someone out of their element. The host stand directed her to table 7. Alberto watched her sit, watched her check her phone, watched her order water for herself and juice for her daughter. At 8:01, Marilyn started folding napkins. At 8:03, 3 men entered from the main entrance. Alberto paused the footage. They didn't check in, didn't wait to be seated. Walked directly toward table 7 like they knew exactly where they were going. Because they did. They'd been watching her. Alberto felt his pulse slow. His breathing deepened the physiological response he'd trained himself to recognize. Not fear. Focus. The state where emotion became fuel instead of distraction. He scrubbed forward. Watched Carlo grip Alicia's collar. Watched the child press into her mother. Watched other diners look away. Then watched himself enter the frame. From this angle, his approach looked different. More predatory. The kind of movement prey animals recognized instinctively. He watched himself speak. Watched the 3 men freeze. Watched the entire room's energy shift like atmospheric pressure before lightning. Alberto stopped the footage and sat back. This wasn't about money Alicia owed. This was about silencing testimony. About eliminating a problem before it metastasized. About making sure a widow with a 6-year-old daughter understood what happened to people who spoke against the machine. His phone buzzed. Text from Gianni. Found the Avalon files. You need to see this. Sending encrypted. 30 seconds later, a PDF arrived. Alberto opened it. Avalon Holdings Property Management. Incident report the 17th of October 2022. Fatal accident at construction site. 447 Morrison Street. David Matthews, age 34, killed when scaffolding collapsed. OSHA investigation pending. 3 previous safety violations documented but not remedied. Family declined settlement offer. Alberto scrolled down. Widow, Alicia Matthews. Filed wrongful death civil suit March 2024. Deposition scheduled. Company counsel recommends settlement to avoid discovery process. Another page. Settlement offer rejected. Mrs. Matthews insists on testimony. Counsel notes. Subject appears motivated by principle rather than financial compensation. Recommend alternative resolution strategies. Alternative resolution strategies. Corporate language for making problems disappear. Alberto's hand tightened on the phone. David Matthews had died because someone decided safety equipment cost more than human life. Alicia had refused to stay silent. And now someone in his organization had decided she needed to learn fear. He scrolled to the final page. Authorization for enhanced collection protocols. Approved by F. Bruno. Executed by L. Bruno. There it was. Franco had authorized it. Luca had executed it. And they'd used Alberto's name, his territory, his reputation, his authority as cover. Alberto closed the file, stood, placed $300 bills on the table, triple what his untouched whiskey cost, and walked toward the exit with the kind of purpose that made the remaining diners instinctively lean back in their chairs. Vincent appeared at his elbow. "Shall I call your car, Mr. Santana?" "No." Alberto's voice was quiet, controlled, absolutely certain. "Call Bruno. Tell him I'm coming to his house. Tell him to be awake. Sir, it's nearly 11. Then he has time to make coffee." Alberto stepped into the night, leaving Bellissimo's golden glow behind. Some conversations required darkness. Franco Bruno's house sat in the hills overlooking the city modern architecture, all glass and steel and angles that screamed, "I've made it." Security lights illuminated the circular driveway. A fountain burbled pretentiously at the entrance. Everything about it announced wealth without taste, power without discretion. Alberto's car pulled up at 11:47 p.m. He didn't knock. The door opened before he reached it. Franco himself, 60 pounds overweight, silk robe over pajamas, hair disheveled, eyes sharp despite the late hour. Behind him, the house glowed with recessed lighting, abstract art on white walls, leather furniture that cost more than most people's cars. "Alberto." Franco's voice carried forced warmth. "This is unexpected." Vincent said it was urgent. "But where's Luca?" The warmth evaporated. "He's asleep. It's nearly midnight. Wake him." It wasn't a request. Franco's face tightened, but he stepped aside. Alberto entered, his shoes silent on Italian marble floors. He didn't sit, didn't accept the offer of coffee or whiskey, just stood in the center of the living room, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed but emanating the kind of tension that made survival instincts scream. Franco disappeared upstairs. Alberto waited. 90 seconds later, footsteps on the staircase. Luca descended, first late 20s, expensive haircut, designer t-shirt and sweatpants, trying to look casual but moving with the stiff uncertainty of someone who'd just been yanked from sleep into a nightmare. Franco followed, now wearing slippers, his face a careful mask of confusion and concern. "Alberto, what's this about?" Franco asked. "It's the middle of the night." Avalon Holdings. 2 words. That's all it took. Luca went pale, actual color draining from his face like someone had opened a valve. Franco's expression froze, then carefully rearranged itself into something resembling ignorance. "What about it?" Franco asked. Alberto pulled out his phone, opened the encrypted file Gianni had sent, turned the screen toward them. The 17th of October 2022. David Matthews, construction worker, died when scaffolding collapsed at one of your properties. OSHA violations. Safety complaints ignored. His widow testified in civil court 3 weeks ago. Silence. "Tonight," Alberto continued, his voice dropping into that dangerous register below normal conversation, 3 men walked into Bellissimo and surrounded that widow and her 6-year-old daughter. Gripped her collar, blocked her exits, terrorized a child. Franco opened his mouth. Alberto raised one finger. "I'm not finished." Franco closed his mouth. "Those 3 men," Alberto said, "were under the impression they were operating with my authority. In my territory, using my name." He paused. "Someone gave them that impression." "Alberto, I can explain." "Then explain." Alberto's eyes locked onto Franco's. "Explain why you authorized intimidation of a civilian witness without clearing it through proper channels. Explain why your nephew," he gestured toward Luca, "executed an operation in my district without permission. Explain why a child was involved." The room held its breath. Franco's mind was clearly racing, calculating angles, measuring responses. He was good at this, had survived in this world for 30 years by knowing when to apologize, when to deflect, when to attack. He chose wrong. The woman was becoming a problem, Franco said, straightening his posture, trying to reclaim authority. Her testimony was exposing financial structures we've worked years to build. The civil suit was drawing attention. I made a judgment call. You made a mistake. The words landed like a sentencing. Alberto, listen. No. Alberto stepped closer, not threatening, not aggressive, just present, filling space with the kind of authority that didn't need volume. You listen. We have rules. No civilian casualties. No collateral damage. No operations in another crew's territory without explicit clearance. And never, his voice sharpened, never involve children. It was just intimidation, pressure. We weren't going to actually. You terrorized a 6-year-old girl in a public restaurant. She was collateral. We needed the mother to understand. That you're willing to harm her daughter? Alberto's jaw tightened. That's the message you wanted to send? Franco's face flushed. You're being emotional. This is business. Sometimes business requires. Don't. Alberto's voice dropped to a whisper. Don't tell me about business. I built this network on rules that keep us invisible. You just made us visible. In front of 50 witnesses. In my restaurant. Using my name. We were protecting organizational interests. You were protecting your incompetence. Alberto turned to Luca, who'd remained silent, frozen like a rabbit watching a wolf decide whether to pounce. Tell me exactly what your uncle told you to do. Luca's eyes darted to Franco, looking for permission, for guidance, for rescue. Don't look at him, Alberto said quietly. Look at me. Luca swallowed hard. He said the woman was a liability, that her testimony was creating exposure, that we needed to encourage her to reconsider. Encourage. Yes. And the child? Luca's voice became smaller. Uncle Franco said. He said fear works better when it's personal. When they understand we can reach anywhere. Alberto felt something cold and ancient settle in his chest. The kind of cold that didn't burn it preserved. It kept rage fresh and patient. He turned back to Franco. You used a child as a weapon. I used leverage. You violated every principle this organization was built on. Alberto's voice remained quiet, controlled, absolutely certain, and you did it using my authority as camouflage. Alberto, you're overreacting. Am I? Alberto pulled out his phone again. Dialed, put it on speaker. 2 rings. A voice answered. Pronto. It's me, Alberto said. I need you to conference in Vitelli, Russo, and Castellano. A pause. All 3? Now. Clicking sounds. Hold music for 15 seconds. Then 3 more voices joined the call, older men, senior members of the council that governed the network's operations. This better be important, Alberto, one of them growled. It's almost midnight. Franco Bruno authorized an unsanctioned operation in my territory, Alberto said calmly. Intimidation of a civilian witness. In a public location. Involving a minor child. Using my name without permission. Silence on the line. The kind of silence that meant calculations were being made. Alliances were being reassessed. Futures were being rewritten. Franco? Vitelli's voice, sharp and demanding. This true? Franco's face had gone from flushed to ashen. There's context. The woman was a civilian witness, Russo interrupted, in a civil lawsuit. Not a threat, not an informant, a widow seeking compensation for her dead husband. She was exposing financial structures that shouldn't have been exposed in the first place, Castellano finished. Because you cut corners on safety equipment, because you ran sloppy operations, because you created the liability you're now trying to silence. Franco opened his mouth. Nothing came out. And you used Alberto's authority, Vitelli continued. Without clearance. That alone is unforgivable, Alberto finished quietly. In our world, using someone's name without permission is theft. Theft of reputation. Theft of trust. He paused. Theft of the only currency that matters. The phone line crackled with tension. What do you want, Alberto? Russo asked. Alberto looked at Franco, then at Luca, then back at the phone. Franco Bruno no longer operates in my territory. Avalon Holdings is dissolved. Assets liquidated. Proceeds go to the Matthews family as settlement full amount. No negotiation. No NDAs. Alberto, that's... Luca Bruno is removed from all operations. Permanently. Luca's knees actually buckled. He caught himself on the arm of a leather chair. And Franco? Alberto's voice remained perfectly calm. Franco understands that if anything happens to Alicia Matthews or her daughter, if they so much as receive a threatening phone call, If someone looks at them wrong in a grocery store, I will hold him personally responsible." The silence that followed was absolute. "Agreed," Vitelli said. "Seconded," Russo added. "Noted and recorded," Castellano confirmed. "Franco, you're lucky Alberto's being merciful." The call ended. Alberto pocketed his phone and looked at Franco Bruno, a man who'd just watched his empire collapse in a single phone call. "You're finished," Alberto said simply. "Not dead, not disappeared, just finished." He turned and walked toward the door. Franco found his voice. "Over a woman? Over one witness?" Alberto stopped, didn't turn around. "Over a child," he said quietly, "who asked me if I was a bad man. And for the first time in 15 years, I didn't know how to answer." He left Franco Bruno standing in his expensive house, surrounded by expensive things, holding exactly nothing. Alberto's driver pulled away from Bruno's house at 12:34 a.m., the city lights blurring into streams of gold and white below the hills. In the back seat, Alberto sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on nothing. His phone buzzed. Text from Gianni. "It's done. Avalon assets frozen. Lawyers working on settlement paperwork. Should have it ready by morning." Another buzz. "Vincent, the lady and her daughter arrived home safely. Driver confirmed they entered the building. No one followed." Alberto should have felt satisfied. The immediate threat was neutralized. Franco was stripped of power. Luca was finished. Alicia and Marilyn were safe, but satisfaction wasn't what he felt. What he felt was the weight of a 6-year-old's question pressing against his chest like a physical thing. "Are you a bad man too?" 35 years earlier, Alberto Santana had been 6 years old. Different city, different restaurant, same fear. His mother, Isabella, 28, beautiful and terrified, worked 3 jobs. Waitress at a diner, night shift cleaning office buildings, weekend catering for weddings. She moved through the world like someone constantly apologizing for taking up space. His father had left when Alberto was 2. No explanation, no forwarding address, just absence that shaped everything around it. On Alberto's 6th birthday, Isabella had saved enough for something special. Dinner at Ristorante Angelo, the nicest Italian place within bus range. They'd dressed up her in a blue dress she'd owned since before he was born, him in khakis and a button-up shirt from the thrift store that almost fit. They'd ordered carefully, split a pasta dish, one dessert to share. Alberto remembered the candle in the tiramisu, remembered making a wish, remembered his mother's smile, rare, genuine, unweighted by exhaustion. Then 3 men had walked in. They'd moved through the dining room like sharks through shallow water, and when they reached the table, one of them tall, expensive suit, smile that made Alberto's stomach hurt, had sat down uninvited. "Isabella," he'd said, "you've been avoiding me. I paid you." His mother's voice had been small. "Last week, I paid the full amount, plus interest. But there's a late fee, and an extension fee, and," the man had shrugged, "an inconvenience fee. I don't have anything else." "Then we have a problem." The man's eyes had drifted to Alberto. "Beautiful kid. What's his name?" Isabella's hand had shot across the table, gripping Alberto's wrist so tightly it hurt. "Don't." Her voice had cracked. "Please, he's 6 years old." "I know." The man had smiled wider. "Old enough to understand consequences. Old enough to remember." Alberto had been terrified, that animal terror that lives in children's bodies before they have words for it. The kind that makes you small and silent and perfectly still. Like not moving might make you invisible. He'd looked around the restaurant, saw other diners watching, then looking away, saw the waiter hovering near the kitchen, frozen with indecision, saw the manager behind the bar, pretending to count receipts. No one had intervened. No one had said a word. The man had leaned close to Isabella, said something Alberto couldn't hear, and left. His mother had cried silently, tears tracking mascara down her cheeks while she gripped Alberto's hand like he might disappear if she let go. They'd left without finishing the tiramisu, took 2 buses home in silence. That night, lying in bed, Alberto had whispered to the darkness, "Mommy, are all strong men bad?" And his mother had answered, "No, mi amor, but the good ones are very, very rare." Present day, in the back of a car gliding through empty streets, Alberto understood something he'd spent 35 years avoiding. He'd become what he needed that night in Ristorante Angelo. Not the man who terrorized his mother, the one who didn't exist, the one who should have stepped forward, the one who should have said, "This stops now." But in becoming that man, he'd built his life on the same foundation of violence and fear, just pointed in different directions, governed by different rules. Are you a bad man too? The question wasn't rhetorical, it was diagnostic. Marilyn hadn't asked if he was dangerous. She'd asked if he was like the men who'd hurt her mother. The distinction mattered. Alberto's phone rang. Not a text this time, an actual call. He glanced at the screen. Gianni, talk to me. Boss, I found something else in the Avalon files. Gianni's voice carried the tension of a man delivering news he knew would detonate. David Matthews, Alicia's husband, he didn't just die in an accident. He filed 3 safety complaints in the 2 weeks before the scaffolding collapsed. OSHA confirmed violations. Equipment failure was predictable, preventable. Alberto's jaw tightened. Who authorized ignoring the complaints? Site supervisor named Torres. But Torres was taking orders from regional management, and regional management reports to Franco. Yeah. Alberto closed his eyes. David Matthews died because Franco didn't want to spend money on equipment upgrades. That's what the paper trail suggests. And when his widow wouldn't accept a settlement, when she insisted on testimony that would expose the entire structure, Franco decided to make her disappear. Not disappear, Gianni corrected quietly. Just break her, make her too afraid to continue, by terrorizing her daughter. Yeah, Alberto felt something twist in his chest. Not anger anymore, something colder, something that lived deeper than rage. Purpose. Gianni, I want you to do something for me. Name it. Find out everything about Alicia Matthews. Not surveillance, I mean her life, her situation, what she needs, where she works, what school Marilyn attends, her debts, her credit, her support network, everything. A pause. Boss, that's a lot of access. I'm not planning to hurt her. I'm planning to help her. Another pause, longer this time. You sure about this? Getting involved in civilian lives? It's exactly what I should have done years ago. Alberto's voice carried finality. And Gianni? No one else hears about this. Not the crew, not the council. This is personal. Understood. The call ended. The car pulled up outside Alberto's building, luxury high-rise, corner penthouse, views of the entire city sprawling below like a circuit board of light. He rode the elevator in silence, entered his apartment, poured 3 fingers of whiskey he wouldn't drink, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows. Somewhere out there, Alicia Matthews was lying awake, holding her daughter, probably still afraid despite his promises. Somewhere out there, a 6-year-old girl was learning that the world contained men who smiled while they hurt you. Somewhere out there, a question hung in the air like smoke. Are you a bad man too? Alberto had given Marilyn an honest answer. I've done bad things. But standing there at 1:47 a.m., looking at a city he controlled through networks of violence and fear, dressed in legitimate business, he realized the answer was incomplete. He'd done bad things. But he'd also done nothing for years, for decades, while people like Alicia suffered at the edges of his empire, while men like Franco cut corners that killed people, while children learned fear from men in expensive suits. He'd built rules to minimize collateral damage. But collateral damage still meant someone's mother, someone's child, someone's life. He'd operated with discipline and restraint, but restraint wasn't the same as justice. And discipline wasn't the same as decency. His phone buzzed one more time. Text from an unknown number. This is Alicia. Your driver gave me this contact. I don't know how to thank you. Marilyn is asleep. First time she slept through the night in weeks. Thank you for giving her that. Alberto stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed a response. She shouldn't have to be afraid. Neither should you. Rest tonight. Tomorrow, things change. He sent it, poured the whiskey down the sink, and stood at the window until dawn broke over the city, turning glass towers pink and gold. By the time the sun rose, Alberto Santana had made a decision that would reshape everything he'd built. Power without protection was just violence with better branding. And if he was going to be the kind of man who intervened, the kind who stepped forward when everyone else looked away, then he couldn't stop at one table, one night, one frightened child. He had to become something he'd never been before. Not softer, accountable. The little girl had asked if he was a bad man. He couldn't change his past, but he could change his answer, starting now. Morning arrived with deceptive gentleness, soft light filtering through Alberto's penthouse windows, the city below stirring awake in layers of traffic and human noise. He'd slept 2 hours, maybe less, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years. Clarity, he'd learned long ago, didn't come from rest. It came from decision. At 7:15 a.m., his phone rang. Gianni. I have the information you requested. Go ahead. Alicia Matthews, 33. Works inventory management at Allied Medical Supply, $42,000 annual. Rents a 2-bedroom apartment in the Riverside District, $1,800 monthly, behind 2 months due to legal fees from the civil suit. Daughter Marilyn attends PS 47, 2nd grade. No family in the area, parents deceased. Husband's family cut contact after his death. They blamed her for the lawsuit. Alberto listened, his jaw tightening with each detail. Credit cards maxed. Student loans from nursing school she never finished, had to drop out when she got pregnant. Medical bills from Marilyn's asthma treatments. She's one emergency away from complete financial collapse. What about the civil suit settlement? Stalled. Avalon's lawyers have been delaying discovery for 8 months. Even if she wins, payout could take years. Not anymore. Alberto's voice carried quiet certainty. By end of business today, she'll have a settlement offer. Full compensation for David's death, plus punitive damages, $2 million, non-negotiable, paid within 30 days. Gianni was quiet for a moment. Boss, that's going to raise questions. Franco's people will notice. Franco's people no longer have standing to notice anything. Alberto stood, moving toward his closet. What else? Her apartment building. It's owned by another shell company, Meridian Properties. Guess who's on the board? Alberto closed his eyes. Franco. His nephew, actually. Luca sits on 3 property management boards. Alicia's building is one of them. How far behind on rent did you say she was? 2 months. Building management sent an eviction notice last week. 30 days to pay or vacate. Alberto's hand tightened on the phone. The machine had been designed to crush her from multiple angles. Lose the lawsuit. Lose her home. Lose her stability. Lose her will to fight. Buy the building, Alberto said. I'm sorry, what? Meridian Properties. Whatever it's worth, offer 20% over market. Today. And when the sale closes, I want Alicia Matthews' rent arrears forgiven. I want her lease renewed at below market rate. And I want the building manager replaced with someone who understands that single mothers with children are not problems to be solved. They're residents to be protected. Alberto. Gianni's voice carried something between awe and concern. You're talking about significant capital, significant visibility. People are going to ask why. Let them ask. Alberto pulled a charcoal suit from his closet, already planning the day ahead. I'm done operating in shadows while the people I'm supposed to be protecting suffer in the light. This is different. This is personal. Everything important is. The line went quiet for 3 long seconds. Okay, boss. I'll make the calls. At 9:30 a.m., Alberto arrived at his office, a corner suite in a downtown building. Legitimate import, export business on paper, nerve center of his network in reality. His assistant, Elena, looked up as he entered, surprise flickering across her face. You're early. I need you to clear my calendar. All of it? Everything non-essential. Alberto moved past her toward his private office. And schedule a meeting with our legal team. This morning. Everyone available. What's this regarding? Corporate restructuring. Elena's eyebrows rose, but she knew better than to ask follow-up questions. She simply nodded and reached for her phone. Inside his office, Alberto stood at the window overlooking the city. Somewhere out there, Alicia was probably getting Marilyn ready for school, braiding her hair, packing her lunch, pretending yesterday hadn't happened, pretending the men in black suits were just a nightmare that daylight had dissolved. But Alberto knew better. Fear didn't evaporate with sunrise. It lived in the body long after the threat had passed, in the way you checked locks twice, glanced over your shoulder at every footstep, startled at sudden noises. Marilyn would carry last night for years. Unless someone showed her that the world also contained protection, that strength could be used for defense instead of harm, that the man who'd stood between her and danger meant what he'd said. Those men won't bother you again. Alberto pulled out his phone and typed a message to the unknown number from last night. How is Marilyn this morning? The response came within minutes. Quiet. She didn't want to go to school. Asked if the bad men knew where we lived. Alberto's chest tightened. He typed, They don't. And even if they did, they can't reach you. I promise. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Why are you helping us? You don't owe us anything. He stared at the question for a long moment before responding. Maybe that's exactly why. Because I don't owe you, I choose you. There's a difference. The dots danced for nearly a minute. I don't know how to accept help from someone like you. Everything I know about men like you says I should be afraid. Alberto typed slowly, carefully. then don't accept help from someone like me. Accept help from someone who saw your daughter's fear and remembered his own. From someone who's tired of building power that protects the wrong people. From someone who's choosing to be better than his reputation. Send. The response took longer this time. Thank you. For whatever this is. For whatever you're doing. Thank you. Alberto pocketed his phone as Elena knocked. Legal team is assembled in conference room B. 6 lawyers sat around the polished table. 3 corporate, 2 criminal defense, 1 specialized in real estate. They looked uncertain, curious, calculating. Alberto remained standing at the head of the table. We're implementing new operational guidelines, effective immediately. His voice carried the authority of someone who didn't need to justify decisions. First, no operations involving civilian witnesses, informants, or anyone outside the network without my explicit approval. Second, all property holdings are to be audited for safety compliance. Any violations are to be corrected immediately, regardless of cost. Third, he paused, letting the weight settle. Any operation that involves minors in any capacity as leverage, as collateral, as witnesses to intimidation, is grounds for immediate removal from the organization. No warnings, no second chances. This is non-negotiable. One of the corporate lawyers, Mitchell, 50-something, 20 years in the network, leaned forward. Alberto, these restrictions are significant. They're going to limit operational flexibility. Good. I'm not sure you understand the implications. I understand perfectly. Alberto's gaze locked onto Mitchell's. For 15 years, I've built this organization on the principle that we're better than the chaos that came before. More disciplined, more strategic, more professional. He paused. But professionalism without principle is just violence in a better suit. And I'm done pretending that's enough. Silence filled the conference room. Last night, Alberto continued, 3 of our people terrorized a woman and her 6-year-old daughter in a public restaurant. They did it using my name. They did it because someone decided that fear was an acceptable business tool, that a child's trauma was an acceptable cost. He let that sink in. That ends now. We're going to operate with one foundational rule. We do not harm people who cannot harm us. We do not create collateral damage. We do not become the thing that justifies people's worst assumptions about who we are. And if that limits our effectiveness? Another lawyer asked. Then we were never as effective as we thought. Alberto straightened. Power that requires terrorizing children isn't power. It's cowardice, dressed in authority. He moved toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. Avalon Holdings is being liquidated. Assets are being sold. Proceeds go to the Matthews family as settlement. I want the paperwork finalized by end of day. $2 million. Full compensation. No NDAs. No gag orders. $2 million? Mitchell's voice carried shock. For a wrongful death settlement? That's unprecedented. Then let it be a precedent. Alberto's voice dropped to that quiet register that meant the discussion was over. Let it be a message. Let every person in this network understand that we are no longer in the business of destroying innocent lives to protect guilty operations. He opened the door. Get it done. At 3:47 p.m., Alberto's phone buzzed. Text from Gianni. Meridian Properties accepted the offer. Building sale closes in 72 hours. Alicia's rent arrears wiped. New lease agreement drafted $1,200 monthly. Locked rate for 5 years. Another message. Settlement paperwork ready. Avalon's lawyers signed. Matthews' family receives full payment in 30 days. Alberto stood at his office window, watching the city move below thousands of lives intersecting, colliding, surviving. He typed a message to Alicia. Check your email. You'll find documents from a law firm. Read them carefully. Sign them. Your fight is over. You won. The response came quickly. I don't understand. What did you do? What should have been done 3 years ago? Justice, protection, compensation for what was stolen from you. A longer pause, then. This is too much. I can't accept. You already did. The moment you refused to stay silent. The moment you chose truth over safety. The moment you protected your daughter while the world looked away. Alberto paused before adding, You earned this. Not from me. From a system that owed you dignity. The final message from Alicia came 20 minutes later. Marilyn asked me tonight if the scary man from the restaurant was an angel. I didn't know how to answer. Alberto smiled small, genuine, tired. He typed, Tell her angels don't exist. But sometimes people choose to be better. That's close enough. 3 men vanished from circulation the day after Alberto left Franco Bruno's house. Not disappeared in the cinematic sense, no shallow graves, no cement shoes, no bodies that would never be found. Just removed, reassigned to territories so far from the city they might as well have been exiled to different planets. Carlo Vanetti ended up in a logging town 600 miles north, collecting protection payments from bar owners who paid in cash and asked no questions. The other two found themselves working dock security in a port city where the wind never stopped and no one remembered their names. They would live, they would work, they would never operate in Alberto's territory again. Franco Bruno lost everything that mattered in his world. Not his house, he kept the glass mansion in the hills. Not his money, his legitimate accounts remained untouched. But his position, his influence, his seat at tables where decisions were made gone, dissolved like sugar in water, leaving nothing but faint sweetness and the memory of substance. Luca Bruno left the city entirely. Last anyone heard, he was managing a car dealership in Nevada, selling SUVs to tourists and pretending his last name didn't carry weight it no longer possessed. The network adjusted. It always did. Nature abhorred vacuums, and organized crime was nothing if not natural. New people stepped into roles Franco had abandoned. Younger, hungrier, but more careful. Everyone had heard what happened. Everyone understood the new rules. No civilians, no children, no operations without clearance. But the real changes happened quietly, in spaces between official business. Alicia Matthews signed the settlement papers on a Tuesday morning, her hands shaking so badly the lawyer had to help her hold the pen. $2 million. Full compensation. No gag orders, no NDAs, no strings that would bind her silence. She'd read the documents 3 times, certain there was a trap hidden in the legal language. There wasn't. It was straightforward, clean, unconditional. That afternoon, she'd received a call from her building manager. A new voice. A woman this time, professional and warm. "Miss Matthews, I'm calling about your lease. There's been an ownership change. Your rent arrears have been forgiven, and we're offering you a lease renewal at a reduced rate. $1,200 monthly, locked for 5 years. Alicia had asked why. The manager had simply said, "New ownership priorities. We're investing in long-term residents." By Friday, Alicia's bank account showed numbers she'd never imagined seeing. By Monday, she'd paid off every debt, credit cards, student loans, medical bills, all of it, gone. By Wednesday, she'd enrolled Marilyn in a better school, one with small class sizes and a counselor who specialized in childhood trauma. By the following Tuesday, she'd quit her job at Allied Medical Supply and enrolled herself back in nursing school to finish the degree she'd abandoned 7 years earlier. And through it all, she kept expecting the cost to reveal itself, kept waiting for someone to knock on her door with the real bill the favor owed, the loyalty demanded, the price that always came due. It never came. Alberto watched from a distance, receiving updates from Gianni that felt more like progress reports than surveillance. Subject enrolled daughter in school. Subject paid off debts. Subject registered for college courses. He never contacted Alicia directly. Never showed up at her building. Never inserted himself into the life he'd helped stabilize. The point wasn't gratitude or connection, it was correction. Making right what his empire had made wrong. But he thought about them often. About Marilyn's question. About the way fear had lived in Alicia's eyes. About how easily the machine he'd built could have crushed them completely if he'd looked away. He didn't look away anymore. The real work happened in conference rooms and late-night calls. Alberto restructured his entire operation, not publicly, not dramatically, but thoroughly. Every property holding was audited for safety. Every business was evaluated for ethical operation. Every person in the network was reminded that collateral damage was no longer acceptable cost. Some people left. Couldn't adapt to rules that limited what power could do. Couldn't stomach working for someone who prioritized principle over profit. Alberto let them go. Better to be smaller and sustainable than large and toxic. Gianni stayed, though he'd asked the question everyone was thinking. "Boss, why now? Why this woman, this family? You've walked past 1,000 problems before." Alberto had considered the question for a long time before answering. "Because she reminded me that looking away is still a choice, and I'm tired of choosing wrong." On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after Bellissimo, Alberto received a text from the unknown number Alicia's phone. "We're moving. Better apartment, better neighborhood. Marilyn starts new school Monday. I wanted you to know. Wanted you to know what your intervention made possible." Alberto stared at the message. Typed, "I'm glad." Deleted it. Typed, "You did this yourself." "I just removed obstacles." Sent it. Her response, You did more than that. You showed Marilyn that strength doesn't always hurt. That's worth more than money." Alberto didn't respond. Couldn't find words adequate to the weight of what she'd said. He simply saved the message and returned to work, the quiet, invisible work of running an empire that was learning, slowly, to be better than its nature. The work of becoming the answer to a child's question. Not perfect, not innocent, not absolved, but better. And some nights, that was enough. 5 weeks after the confrontation, Alberto returned to Bellissimo. Same night of the week, same time, same table 12 with its clear sightlines and familiar weight of ritual. Vincent greeted him at the door with the subtle nod of someone who understood that certain things didn't require discussion. The restaurant glowed with its usual golden elegance, chandeliers casting warm light, violins weaving through hushed conversations, the scent of saffron and wine and money. Everything looked the same. Everything felt different. Alberto sat, and within moments a whiskey appeared. Macallan, 18. Neat. Exactly as he preferred. He didn't drink it immediately. Just let it sit, amber liquid catching light, while his eyes traced the familiar geography of the dining room. Table 7 sat empty tonight. White tablecloth pristine, fresh flowers in a crystal vase, waiting for diners who would have no idea what had happened there 5 weeks ago. The restaurant had no memory of violence. It simply reset, night after night, offering beauty and discretion to whoever could afford the cover charge. But Alberto remembered. He remembered the angle of approach, the way Carlo's hand had gripped Alicia's collar, the sound of Marilyn's whimper cutting through expensive ambiance like a knife through silk. He remembered the weight of decision, the moment between observing and intervening, between walking away and stepping forward. He remembered choosing. A couple was seated at table 7, now late 30s, anniversary dinner perhaps, laughing softly over wine. The woman touched her husband's hand across the table. Normal, safe, unremarkable. Alberto watched them and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not pride, relief. That table could hold joy again, could hold ordinary happiness, could exist in the present instead of being haunted by what had almost happened there. His phone buzzed. Text from Gianni. Monthly report ready. Revenue down 8% across the board. Some partners are concerned about the new restrictions. Alberto typed back. Let them be concerned. Quality over quantity. Another message appeared, this time from an unknown number, though he recognized it immediately. Marilyn drew a picture today in art class. She titled it, The Angel Man. Her teacher asked who that was. Marilyn said, someone who helped when no one else would. Thought you should know. Alberto stared at the message for a long time. He didn't respond. Didn't know how to respond. Didn't trust himself to find words that wouldn't cheapen what the child had created. A narrative where he wasn't the dangerous man from her nightmares but something else entirely. Not an angel. He'd told Alicia that angels didn't exist. But maybe something adjacent. Something human choosing to be better than circumstance demanded. He pocketed his phone and finally lifted the whiskey glass. Across the dining room, a family entered, mother, father, daughter, about Marilyn's age. The little girl wore a dress the color of strawberries. Her hair in careful braids. She skipped between her parents, safe and oblivious, the way children should be. Alberto watched them be seated. Watched the parents help their daughter into a chair. Watched the family lean together over menus, pointing, discussing, deciding, ordinary, beautiful, fragile. And for the first time in 15 years, Alberto understood something fundamental about power. It meant nothing if it only protected itself, if it only defended its own territory, its own interests, its own survival. Real power, meaningful power, was measured by what it protected that couldn't protect itself. Vincent appeared at his elbow. Your usual, Mr. Santana? The veal? No. Alberto's eyes remained on the family across the room. Something different tonight. Any preferences? Surprise me. Vincent's eyebrows rose fractionally in all the years Alberto had dined here. He'd never deviated from his usual order, but the maître d' simply nodded and disappeared toward the kitchen. The meal that arrived 20 minutes later was delicate. Complex sea bass with lemon and herbs, risotto the color of saffron, vegetables arranged like art. Alberto ate slowly, tasting each element, present in the moment in a way he hadn't been for years. He'd spent decades eating meals while his mind worked 3 moves ahead, calculating angles, anticipating threats, planning contingencies. Tonight, he just ate. Just existed in the space between decisions. Just watched a restaurant full of people living ordinary lives, unaware of the invisible architecture of violence and protection that kept their evening unremarkable. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Alicia. I don't know if you'll respond, but if you're reading this, thank you. Not just for the money or the safety, for showing my daughter that strength can be gentle, that power can choose kindness. She needed to see that. So did I. Alberto set down his fork, picked up his phone. Typed. She's stronger than she knows. So are you. I just removed obstacles. Everything after that was your courage, not my intervention. He sent it before he could reconsider. Her response came quickly. Will we ever see you again? Alberto considered the question, really considered it, turning it over like a stone in his hand. Finally, he typed, You don't need to. That's the point. He finished his meal, left cash on the table, generous but not ostentatious, and stood to leave. As he passed table 7, he paused for just a moment. The couple didn't notice him. They were lost in each other, in their celebration, in their small, perfect bubble of happiness. Alberto moved on. At the door, Vincent handed him his coat. Will we see you next week, Mr. Santana? Yes. Alberto smiled slightly. Same table, of course. Alberto stepped into the night, leaving Bellissimo's golden glow behind. The words echoed in his mind, not as threat, but as boundary, as principle, as promise. Wrong table, wrong day, not a warning to enemies, a commitment to himself. Some tables were sacred, some days demanded intervention. Some lines, once drawn, redefined everything, and Alberto Santana had finally learned which side of the line he wanted to stand on. Alberto stood on his penthouse balcony. The city spread below him like a circuit board of light. Wind carried the scent of rain, not falling yet, just promised, heavy in the air. His phone sat on the glass table beside an untouched glass of wine. No calls tonight, no emergencies, no crises requiring immediate attention, just silence. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, silence felt like peace instead of waiting. Inside, his laptop displayed spreadsheets, the legitimate ones, the businesses that operated in daylight, import companies, investment portfolios, real estate holdings that generated revenue without destroying lives. The numbers were lower than they'd been 6 months ago. The restrictions he'd implemented had cost him partnerships dissolved, revenue streams redirected, people who couldn't operate under the new rules taking their business elsewhere, but the numbers were clean. No blood in the margins. No fear baked into the profit. No children's nightmares financing his lifestyle. It was enough. Earlier that evening, he'd received a package. No return address, but he recognized Alicia's handwriting on the label. Inside, a drawing on construction paper. Crayon and marker, the fierce, confident strokes of a 7-year-old's hand. A man in a black suit standing between stick figures, 3 on one side, 2 on the other. The 2 figures were labeled in careful letters, Mommy and Me. The 3 figures had angry scribbled faces. The man in black had no face, just a body positioned between threat and protection. At the bottom, in Marilyn's handwriting, Thank you for helping us. Love, Marilyn. And below that, in Alicia's adult script, She wanted you to have this. Said angels should know they're appreciated, even if they say they're not angels. Alberto had taped the drawing to his refrigerator, absurd placement for a man who lived alone in minimalist luxury. But every time he opened the door, he saw it. Saw himself through a child's eyes, not the man he'd been, the man he'd chosen to become. His phone buzzed. Text from Gianni. The Castellano situation is resolved. No escalation. Everyone's cooperating with the new protocols. Alberto typed back. Good. Keep it that way. Another message. Boss, people are talking, saying you've changed, saying you've gone soft. Alberto smiled slightly. Let them talk, and if they test the boundaries, then they'll learn I haven't gone soft, just more selective about where I apply pressure. He pocketed his phone and returned his attention to the city below. Millions of lives down there, people sleeping, working, fighting, loving, surviving. Most of them would never know his name. Would never know that their safety was sometimes the result of invisible interventions, quiet corrections, power choosing restraint. That was fine. He didn't need recognition. He needed to sleep without hearing a child's voice asking if he was a bad man. Somewhere in the city, Alicia Matthews was probably helping Marilyn with homework, tucking her into bed, reading stories that ended with safety instead of fear. Somewhere, a restaurant was serving dinner to people who would never know what almost happened at table 7. Somewhere, Men who'd once operated without conscience were learning that boundaries had consequences. And here, 43 stories above the streets, Alberto Santana stood in the space between who he'd been and who he was becoming. Not redeemed. Redemption required innocence he'd never possessed. Not forgiven. Forgiveness required debts he could never fully repay. But accountable. Finally, genuinely accountable, not to law or rivals or even his own network, but to the principle that power unchosen was just violence waiting to happen. The rain started soft at first, then building to steady percussion against glass and steel. Alberto watched it fall, washing the city clean, temporary erasure of grime and exhaust and the residue of human passage. By morning, it would all be back. The city would reset, just like Bellissimo reset every night, pristine and ready for whatever came next. But something fundamental had shifted, not in the city. In him, he'd spent 15 years building an empire on the principle that discipline was enough, that rules separated him from chaos, that strategic violence was somehow cleaner than random cruelty. But Marilyn's question had exposed the flaw in that logic. Are you a bad man too? The two mattered. It meant she understood bad men existed in categories, some worse than others, some redeemable, some not. Alberto had answered honestly, I've done bad things, but standing here in the rain-washed night, he understood the answer was incomplete. He'd done bad things, but he'd also chosen, in one critical moment, to do better. And that choice, that single intervention on a wrong table on a wrong day, had rewritten everything that came after. His phone buzzed one final time. Message from the unknown number. Marilyn says goodnight to the angel man every night before bed. Just thought you should know. Sleep well, Alberto. You earned it. He stared at the message. Typed. Tell her angels don't need thanks. They just need people to believe good things are possible. Sent it. Deleted the conversation thread. Not because he wanted to forget. Because some things were meant to be felt, not archived. Alberto returned inside, closed the balcony door against the rain, and stood in his living room. The drawing on the refrigerator caught his eye one more time, stick figures in crayon and a child's understanding of protection. He'd told Alicia that angels didn't exist, that people just chose to be better. Standing there, looking at evidence that his choice mattered, Alberto understood something final. He wasn't an angel, wasn't a hero, wasn't even particularly good, but he'd become something more important. Present. Present in the moment when intervention mattered. Present when everyone else looked away. Present when a child needed to see that strength could defend instead of destroy. That was enough. Not redemption. Not absolution. Just enough. The rain fell harder, drumming against windows, washing the city clean in temporary grace. And Alberto Santana, Mafia boss, protector, man who'd finally learned which battles mattered, turned off the lights and went to bed. Tomorrow, the city would wake unchanged, but he wouldn't. And somewhere in that difference lived the answer to a child's question. Wrong table, wrong day, gentlemen. Not a threat, a promise. The promise that some lines, once drawn, stay drawn forever. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.